With training camps about a month away from opening, we have a big question: which Eastern Conference teams will rise this year and which are most likely to fall? We've got all that and a lot more on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to the Wednesday edition of the Locked On NHL podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I want to thank everyone who makes Locked On NHL your first listen every day. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so you can get new episodes as soon as they drop. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. I'm Gil Martin. I'm in for Ross Levitan today, and with me is Mike DiStefano. And Mike, how you doing today?
Doing well. Can't say there's a whole lot going on in the hockey world these days, but I am doing okay. At least the Olympics are here to kind of fill the void. Everyone loves watching the Olympics.
Yeah, no, love the Olympics, enjoying every minute of that. And yet, we're getting closer and closer to training camp. We're now about a month away, and I'm starting to think hockey's not that far off, and I'm getting a little excited about the upcoming season. And, we were talking about the upcoming season and looking at the Eastern Conference and trying to figure out, three teams that we think will be better and on the rise this year, and three teams that we think will probably fall back and struggle a little bit more than they did a year ago. Mike, why don't you start us off with your first team that you think will rise?
Sure, absolutely. I think that the way that I kind of looked at my list, there's two factors that go into my list of both risers and fallers. One, if we're looking at teams that are rising, I think that there's a couple of squads that really truly underperformed last year that I can't see them doing that again. I think that they'll play up to expectation this year and have a much better season. And then I do have a team that I think is just ready to take a step. But the team that I look at the underperforming squads last year, and there's no team that performed worse to expectation to me than the New Jersey Devils. I mean, this was a team that at the beginning of the season, I'm out here exclaiming, "Hey, the East runs through the Devils! Like they're going to be beasts out here. Like they are legitimate Stanley Cup contenders." They didn't even make the playoffs. It was sad. It was embarrassing. It was an awful take by me. It was an even worse play by them. But they got the goaltending sorted out. That was the biggest issue with that New Jersey Devils team. They just could not buy a save for the life of them. It was crazy. They ended up they scored 264 goals, but had 283 goals scored against them. They were minus 19, which, to be honest with you, would have been third in the entire division here. Fourth in the division. That's less goals than both the Capitals, who did make the playoffs, who got them in the playoffs. And then also, I think that's more in the Flyers. But they finally got the goaltending shored up. And health has always been a big issue for that team as well. I think Dougie Hamilton getting healthy should be ready to go for the start of the season. If Jack Hughes can stay on the ice, if Nico Hischier can stay on the ice. I like Dawson Mercer as a nice little rebound season. He didn't have a great one last year. You've got Simon Nemec, nice, good young defenseman. Luke Hughes, a good young defenseman. I think that this is a team that is ready to take that step. They got the goaltending all sorted out, and they got a new coach in Sheldon Keefe, who I think is a very good coach. Obviously, I watched him for a long time here in Toronto. It's not that he wasn't able to get the job done, just I think the relationship had soured. I do think he's a good coach. I think he'll be able to get a lot out of this New Jersey Devils team. So for me, I think the Devils are the number one team in the East that are going to see massive improvements from last year to this year.
They were atop my list as well. And you look at the injuries, as you mentioned, and then they added some pieces, and the biggest pieces are obviously in goal. Jacob Markstrom, I think, just will make a big, big difference for this team. And then staying healthy, obviously, is key. I mean, they lost so many key components, especially on the blue line, that just really hampered that team. And when your blue line is banged up and your goaltending is questionable to begin with, that's sort of a recipe for disaster. I see the Devils being a lot better. I think maybe 2 years ago they were a little ahead of schedule, and then the injuries and the fact that they were a little ahead of schedule caused them to stumble a little bit last year. But I think the arrow is pointed up in New Jersey as well.
Yeah, completely agree. And if they come out and lay another stinker, I'm done with them. I'll tell you that. I will not come on the show next year and say this is the year for the Devils. If 2 years in a row you lay an egg, you don't make the playoffs after all this hoopla, I'm done with you. So that's the warning to the New Jersey Devils.
That's a fair warning for sure. How about your second rising team?
Yeah, it's another team that I think just kind of underperformed last year. The Buffalo Sabres. I like Buffalo. I like the mix, the nucleus they got there. I think that players like Alex Tuck, Tage Thompson, Rasmus Dahlin. It sounds like they finally have a good goaltending group. Tandem at least. Ukko-Pekka Luukkonen really came on at the end of last season. Devin Levi is a good young goaltender who has played some solid hockey in the minors and is hoping to get himself back up into the big club and they could be a successful tandem. But I like that team a lot. And they're kind of going back to the old school Lindy Ruff coaching tree. So they're bringing him back into the fold. And I think that he'll be able to get a lot out of that group. Apparently it was a little bit of a country club. That past season in Buffalo, I think that Ruff will demand a lot more from them and they should be able to improve. I don't know if they'll quite make the playoffs, but it will definitely be a team that'll compete right to the very end for one of those wild card spots. So for me, I'm liking what the Buffalo Sabres are selling at this point.
Yeah, I agree that they'll be right in that mix for the playoffs down to probably the last, game or two, and then it'll either just make or just miss. I mean, we've been talking about the Sabres and sort of the young core that they've been building around for a couple of years now, and yet they always seem to come up just short. And, I think they do have the goaltending more or less straightened out right now with a solid 1-2 punch. Uh, it's just maybe a question as compared to last year of getting a little bit more offensive production.
Yeah, 100%. And like Dylan Cousins in his second full season, I guess, didn't, he had a big down year for them. Tage Thompson did not have his traditional 40-goal seasons like he had the couple years prior. Alex Tuck, I think, dealt with some injuries and wasn't really scoring a whole lot. So there's some guys who I think had down years collectively. And I'm projecting that doesn't happen again. And you see 22, 23-year-old Dylan Cousins just go back to being, a top line centerman like he projected to be to me in his first year in the NHL. He scored 20 some odd goals and he looked really good as a 20-year-old in the NHL. Not so much a 21-year-old, but I think at 22, he'll learn from last season. He'll put it all together. And they really filled out the depth too. That's what they spent this offseason building up depth and building up, some size back there as well. And some veterans up in their third and fourth lines. So I like what they've done. I see Buffalo as one of the teams that'll be competing for sure this year.
Yeah, I think so too. And it's time, I think, for all of this investment that the Sabres have made to finally start to pay off. And you talked about depth, and that's always important, especially with younger guys. I think younger players will tend to press a little bit more because they are a little less experienced. And I think getting some of those depth pieces and not asking some of these young guys to do too much or worry about, what's the guy next to me going to do, I think that's going to help the Buffalo Sabres a great deal. And again, the talent is there. It's just a question of getting it together, getting this team to gel. And I think they will finally do that this year. And, it's time for them to end the playoff drought as far as Sabres fans are concerned. I think it's been far too long.
Yeah, I think it's been since 2011, maybe, I think is how long. Yeah, it's quite a while. Our friend Jody Biasi at Locked On Sabres has got to be just in such a bad mood every April. Every April. The final team that I see making a bit of a rise up the rankings and up the standings this year, I think this is finally the year that the Ottawa Senators take that step. I do think this is the season they get it done. Continuing with the theme of new coach, I guess, possibly get the new coach bump with Travis Green coming in. And they too, just like Ottawa, feel like they finally solidified the goaltending position. They bring in Linus Ullmark, who obviously, he won Vezina a couple of years ago, a couple Williams Jennings awards. They're hoping that he can really solidify that position in net and then just, finally get that improvement from the group from within, right? See Stützle take that next level into superstardom, allow Josh Norris to stay healthy for a full season. You've got Shane Pinto will be around for a full season. They signed David Perron, who could hopefully add some, couple more goals for them. And then did they end up doing? I don't think they really did much on defense. Oh, they brought in Nick Jensen defensively too, who could slide in and be a good shutdown defenseman. That's kind of what they needed, was someone on the right side who could play that style of game. So, I like what they did this summer. Again, not really saying that they're going to be a playoff team, but I think they'll certainly compete for a playoff position and be one of those teams that'll fight to the very end for that wild card spot.
Yeah, I sort of see them in that same area as well. And this is to me such a telling season for Ullmark. You mentioned the Vezina Trophy 2 years ago, and yet, his critics said, well, yeah, but he was playing in front of the best, point percentage team in NHL history. It was more the team in front of him than him. I think we're going to find out a lot about Linus Ullmark this year in Ottawa.
Yeah, I kind of want to see that too, to be fair, though. I think it's a fair criticism. He did diddly squat in Buffalo where there wasn't a good defensive structure and presence in front of him. All of a sudden, he goes over to Boston, one of the best structured teams in the NHL, and he turns into a Vezina goalie. So, was it the chicken or the egg? Did something click, or was he just not tested as much as he was, or in different ways like he was in Buffalo? Because I think the play in front of him is going to resemble far closer to what he had to deal with in front of him in Buffalo than it will be in Boston.
Yeah, I agree. Or it certainly won't be elite play in front of him. So, I think that's sort of the linchpin for their season, is how good Ullmark will be. And I don't think he has to have numbers like he had in Boston, but he's got to steal a few games for him along the way.
Yeah, for sure.
We will see how that plays out, but those are our three rising teams. Now, when we come back, we'll discuss who our falling team candidates are. We'll have that and a lot more coming up on this episode of the Locked On NHL podcast. Today's episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Ditch the busy work. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. You could join more than 3.5 million businesses worldwide that use Indeed to hire great talent fast. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. So teams that we think will fall off, and these may be a little tougher to figure than the rising teams. But who topped your list, Mike?
Yeah, so this one was a little bit more difficult because I think that the East is a very strong conference, and there's not a lot of teams that I think are willing to take a step back that, said, hey, we're going to unload a bunch of our players and we're just not going to be going for it next year. We're going to make it a retooling season. I think, honestly, today, I don't think there's like one team that honestly is like a San Jose level bad or Chicago level bad or Anaheim level bad where it's like there's no way that team's going to compete and they know from day one of camp. I think every single team in the Eastern Conference believes they have a shot to make the playoffs, which made this a little bit difficult when it comes to talking about teams who might take a step back. That being said, there is one team in particular who, to me, lost quite a bit this offseason, not by choice, but it just happened to be. And that is the Carolina Hurricanes. And this is a team that's been up at the top of the Metropolitan Division for a few years now. Not to say that they're going to fall off and that they're not going to make the playoffs, but I think it's going to be a little bit more of an adjustment early, specifically. I mean, they lost Brett Pesce. They ended up losing. Who's the other defenseman? Why am I blanking? Lost a couple of big time blue liners for sure. And I just think that this is a team that's getting older. They lost some forward talent up front. To me, they lost, a lot. Their GM also ended up leaving. Oh, Teuvo Teravainen ended up taking off. Jake Gensel, they couldn't retain him, so he ended up going to Tampa Bay. So, I think that there's just a lot that this group, took a lot of bodies off of that roster ultimately, and they got it dealt with when it came to Martin Nakash. So he'll be around, we believe. He's got a contract at the very least now, so at least he'll have an opportunity in the top six with a couple of those guys, departing. But for me, I just think that that's a team. They still are kind of rolling the dice a little bit in net with Freddie Anderson, and they also got Pyotr Kochetkov, who I like as a goalie, but he's still very young, and they're still going to be pretty much being a tandem. But it's a group that to me was always, top three teams in the NHL when it came to roster building. Not so sure on paper that roster looks as good as a top three team does now. Definitely doesn't look as good as it did when the season was over this past season for them. So for me, I think they're a team that I'm probably a little lower on than I was last year.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, look, they had 111 points last year. They could be 10 games worse and still, be in a solid position for the playoffs. I think they're still a playoff team. I mean, I love Rod Brindamore as a coach. I think he'll find a way to maximize the talent on this roster. But at the same time, there is not as much depth and not as much talent as there was a year ago. And Carolina has been one of those teams where every year entering the playoffs, you think this is a team that could go all the way. And every year they've just sort of stumbled at some point in the playoffs. I think they do take a little bit of a step back, but I think they're still, one of the top 5 or 6 teams in the Eastern Conference, and they'll be back in the playoffs.
Oh, I agree with that. I still think they're a playoff team. I just don't know if they're necessarily the team to beat in the East anymore. And they could quickly change that. I mean, they certainly could quickly change that. Brady Shea was the other defenseman I was trying to think of, by the way, that departed. To me, I have them as like a pretty good landing spot for Patrick Laine too. They ended up with Patrick Laine. They add that to their top 6, and he returns to form. That's a bit more of a dangerous squad now. So they could make some moves that could definitely, enhance their chances within the season. But right now I got them as one of my teams on the downturn. I also have, Gil, your New York Islanders as a team. I think they made the playoffs last year. They had a good surge after Patrick Waugh got hired, but I just still look at that team and I don't see a whole lot of talent. Like I just don't look at a team that looks like they're going to be able to compete and make the playoffs. Well, they'll compete, but I don't see them as one of the top 8 teams in this league. Barring, I guess, Sorokin coming back to being an absolute animal, top 3 goalie in the league, which he was 2 years ago. Which when he's not playing that way, well, we saw what happened and the warts that are on this team. So for me, I think the Islanders could be in jeopardy of losing that one of those final playoff spots this upcoming season and maybe miss out by a little bit.
See, I think the Islanders have the potential to improve slightly, although I think other teams in the conference may have improved more because Lou Lamoriello has left them so cap strapped. I mean, they're over the cap right now if they want to field 23 players on their NHL roster. The addition of Anthony Duclair, I like. If Sorokin bounces back, I think they'll be fine. I still see the Islanders as one of those teams somewhere between 7th and 10th in the conference, where they'll either just make or just miss the playoffs. And then, teams like Buffalo and Ottawa and Detroit and Washington will probably be the other teams like in the thick of that fight for those 2 wild card spots, or maybe if everything breaks right, 3rd place in the division.
It's possible. Don't get me wrong. It's definitely possible. There's just a lack of firepower on that team, and in today's modern NHL, you got to have guys who can put the puck in the back of the net. And there's just not a whole lot of them on the New York Islanders. So yeah, if Sorokin can, make sure everything's, it's a 1-0, 2-1 hockey game, they'll have a good shot to do so. But if they got to score 3-4 goals in a game, it becomes difficult for your Islanders. The Flyers are the team that I have as my final team that's trending downward. I just thought that they overperformed last year. I mean, they were right into it up until the very end. Obviously, they had 87 points last year in 82 games. They were an above 500 team. But for me, I think they overperformed. I don't think this is a squad that's ready to take that next step and be, ready to compete for a wild card spot. I think it would be best for them also to kind of just linger, use it as a building block year. I think they'll probably end up moving on from some pieces at the deadline, probably. And they still do not have the goaltending situation settled, obviously, after the Carter Hart departure, we'll call it. So that's going to be a struggle for them, is figuring out who's going to work in net at this point for Philadelphia. But that's a team that I think overachieved a little bit last year and probably will be closer to the bottom of the Eastern standings than the top.
I could see that because, essentially they did not make too many major additions in the offseason. I also think they overachieved, early in the year, and then late in the year, they just sort of fell apart. Their big move was really bringing in Matvei Michkov, and signing him and getting him here from Russia earlier than expected. How much he's going to add in his first NHL season remains to be seen. I think, again, there's just too many holes in this lineup. So I could see the Flyers taking a step back this year based on the fact that, I agree with you. They overachieved during especially the first 60, 65 games a year ago.
Yeah. So, John Tortorella is a good coach. I like him a lot, and he's been able to get a lot out of that group. He certainly did last year, but I don't know. I just, this season, I think there's a lot more teams that'll leapfrog them, and they won't be able to pull as many points off those squads as they were able to do a year ago. So for me, I think Flyers fans, unfortunately, probably not going to be watching a very competitive team this year.
We shall see. We've got some more possible teams that will fall, plus we'll discuss how this changes things in the Eastern Conference. All of that and more coming up on today's Locked On NHL podcast.
Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Game Time is an authorized ticket marketplace of Major League Baseball, which makes getting tickets faster and easier. Prices on the Game Time app actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. With killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from receipt, and their lowest price guarantee, Game Time takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. They've got last-minute deals that allow you to save up to 60% off buying last minute for sporting events, concerts, comedy, theater, whatever you're looking to get tickets to. You can find them on the Game Time app. Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets with Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account, redeem the code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
So I had a couple of teams on my list for fallers that were a little different than yours. And, again, I guess this is all kind of relative when you're looking at fallers, because the first of the teams on my list, I still think they're going to be a very good team, but I just don't think they're going to be as good as they were a year ago. And I'm going to start with the Boston Bruins.
Mm.
Uh, I mean, Boston had 109 points last year. I could easily see them, being in the high 90s or very, right around 100 points, and yet still that would be, 10 games, let's say, less than where they were a year ago. And I think the loss of Olmark is going to play into that, because their goaltending tandem was so much a part of their success. And it wasn't just the individual fine play of Olmark and Swayman. It was the way they complemented each other both on and off the ice that I think is going to be a part of the change here in Boston.
Yeah, I much like, the Devils, I keep coming back to it and I keep saying this is the year they take the step. This is the year for them. Every year I feel like I've been saying now for a couple that Boston's gonna fall off. I mean, it's gotta happen. Marchand's a year older, no Krejci, no Pasternak, right? Chara's gone, Tuukka Rask is gone, and they just keep churning out wins. They just keep churning out dubs and winning games. So I no longer want to make that proclamation that the Boston Bruins are going to be, taking a step back, because I've said that far too many times. But yeah, you make some solid points. They did make a couple of decent additions though, like bringing in Elias Lindholm, I think was pretty big.
Yes.
And they kind of needed someone as a top six centerman that was better than Zacha, better than Coyle, and he should be able to provide that top line center role who can also play a 200-foot game. But ultimately, yeah, I am curious to see how the goaltending is going to be. Korpisalo, he's had some ups and downs, I think we could say, throughout his career. But much like when Olmark got to Boston, things went right for him. I wonder if Korpisalo, playing in front of a well-structured defensive unit there, will he be able to play just as well or close to it? We'll see, because at this point, I mean, you just kind of have to assume that Boston's going to play that well, and it's going to reflect nicely on the goaltenders. But certainly that's going to be an interesting team to watch, especially early in the season as they try and sort out all the change.
Yeah, they got off to such a hot start last year. I think they surprised a lot of people with that. And,
Yeah.
with Korpisalo, as you alluded to, it's all about the consistency, because the talent is certainly there. The other team I had on my list of teams I think will fall was the Pittsburgh Penguins. And I think just
Mhm.
age is to me the big part of that. And again, kind of like Boston, a lot of people have been saying it for a few years. Yeah, this is the time the Pittsburgh Penguins are finally going to slow down and fall off. But, at the same time, when you've still got Evgeny Malkin and Sidney Crosby on your roster, how far can they fall, right?
It's yes, totally. He's always going to allow you to think that you can always win a game. And look, Sidney Crosby almost dragged that team into the playoffs last
Yes.
year with like a 12% power play, and they still somehow were only a couple points off from making that playoff push. So, yeah, I think that this is going to be a team. It's unfortunate because they tried to keep the band together. They gave that big contract to Malkin. They gave the contract to Chris Letang, and they just kind of tried to keep the Sid happy. Ultimately, I think is what happened. And then now it's like, it's starting to fall off here, boys. It's starting to fall off here. They'd made the trade for Erik Karlsson, got even older. They got more skilled, but they got older. And it's like, all right, what are we doing? What is this team?
Right.
That is an interesting franchise. Like what they're gonna look like in, I don't know, 3 years time is certainly going to be interesting. Has Sid signed his deal yet, by the way? I don't think he
No,
signed his extension
not
yet.
yet. And, to me, the question is, how does a team with Letang and Carlson and Crosby and Malkin have a 12% power play?
And it was honestly the biggest question mark last year. It was like, yeah, like how was that possible? It
Yeah.
was they went like the entire month of like November or something like that without a power play goal. It was insane. Absolutely insane.
So, Mike, with all these teams that we listed, how, if at all, do you think this changes the playoff picture in the Eastern Conference? Do we see any teams that made it last year that you think will be out, and who would take their place?
Well, if I had to like put money on one and I had to go on to FanDuel and lay the bet, you can find those wagers where it's make the playoffs, yes or no. I think I'd put money on the New Jersey Devils making the playoffs this year, like they didn't last year, but I do believe that they will this year. And the team that I have to take out probably would be the Islanders. I think the Capitals, they'll be in a dogfight too, although they had an interesting offseason. I actually maybe one of the few people who liked their offseason and think they got better as a group. But the Islanders for me are probably that playoff team that I think falls out of it. Sorry, Gil. I
No,
apologize.
hey, it's within the realm of possibility, and like you said, I think it's going to be a dogfight, and I have the Islanders in that 7 to 10 spot, somewhere in just making or just missing the playoffs, and I think I would put maybe Washington, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Ottawa, Detroit. Those are the teams that are going to fight for those last couple of playoff spots, and we'll see who ends up making it. But going to be interesting, and we're getting closer and closer to the new season. Mike, want to thank you and want to thank everyone for letting me come in and join you the last couple of weeks with Ross away. I want to thank everyone for making Locked On NHL your first listen today. Now go check out Locked On NHL Prospects, where you'll get the lowdown on some of the great prospects, both for next year's draft and from teams around the NHL with our experts. So you can find the link to Locked On NHL Prospects, so you don't need to search. It's all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm Gil Martin. He's Mike DiStefano. Have a great day, everyone, and thanks for listening to and watching the Locked On NHL Podcast.